Nobody talks about what transformation actually costs. Every conversation about personal growth focuses entirely on the gain side of the ledger: clarity, peace, better relationships, a truer, more solid sense of self. What almost none of them mention is that becoming someone different requires losing someone specific, not metaphorically, actually losing them, the way you'd lose a person. And that loss is real and worth grieving properly, even when the person you're losing wasn't good for you, wasn't serving you, was in fact the exact version you were trying to leave behind. The self that has to end. Start with what change theorist William Bridges called the ending phase, part of a broader transition framework he developed, studying how people move through significant life changes, in organizations and in personal life alike. Bridges' model is a practitioner framework rather than a controlled empirical study, but its central claim has held up well against how people actually describe going through major change, and it's worth stating plainly because it inverts a common assumption. Most people assume a transition begins with a beginning, the new job, the new habit, the new way of relating to people. Bridges' framework argues the opposite. Every transition actually begins with an ending. And that ending is not simply a preamble to the good part. It is, in his framework, a genuine and necessary loss in its own right, one that has to be lived through rather than skipped past on the way to whatever comes next. This matters because most self-improvement content is built entirely around the new beginning, the after photo, the after routine, the after version of the relationship you're finally free to have with yourself. It skips directly past the ending, as though the old self simply evaporates the moment the new habit is installed, with nothing lost in the process worth acknowledging. Bridges' framework says that's not what actually happens. Something specific has to end first, and an ending, by its nature, is a loss, regardless of how necessary or overdue it was. Sociologists Peter Burke and Jan Stetz, developing what's known as identity theory, describe identity not as a single fixed trait, but as an internal standard the mind is constantly checking present behavior and feedback against, working to keep the two aligned. Their research treats identity change, even wanted, deliberate identity change, as inherently disruptive to this internal verification process, because for a period, the old standard hasn't been fully replaced, and the new one hasn't yet stabilized, and that gap generates real, measurable psychological distress, not because the change is wrong, but because the underlying mechanism doesn't distinguish between disruption you wanted and disruption forced on you from outside. It responds to the mismatch itself. The concept of possible selves, developed by psychologists Hazel Marcus and Paula Nurius. The imagined future versions of yourself that function as genuine psychological structures, actively shaping present motivation and behavior, not idle fantasy. When you become a fundamentally different person, deliberately through sustained effort, you're not simply adjusting a few habits at the margins. You're retiring an entire possible self, the version of you who would have continued being anxious in exactly the familiar way, who would have kept the same defensive humor, who would have stayed in the same comfortable smallness a little longer. That version was never merely a set of behaviors. It was, in Marcus and Nurius's framework, a genuine imagined future you'd been building toward or living inside of for years, sometimes since childhood, and retiring it is a real loss. Structurally similar to other forms of grief, whether or not it gets treated as one. This is precisely why the grief in this specific situation feels so disorienting and so hard to talk about honestly. You're not grieving a person who left you, you're grieving a version of yourself that you deliberately, effortfully killed off on purpose because you believed correctly that it needed to go. Grief doesn't have a clean category for a loss you caused yourself on purpose for good reason. Most cultural scripts for grief assume the loss was done to you. This one was done by you, which leaves it with almost nowhere to go. The system around you resists the change too. The loss compounds further because personal transformation rarely happens in isolation, and the people around you were, whether they realized it or not, calibrated to the previous version of you. The finding that any relational system settles into an equilibrium that both parties adapt around, and that disrupting that equilibrium, even through positive change, generates resistance from the system itself, an unconscious pullback toward the previous familiar balance, Apply this specifically to personal transformation, and something painful becomes visible. The friend who liked you more anxious because your anxiety made them feel needed. The family member who preferred you smaller because your smallness made comparisons easier. The partner who benefited, consciously or not, from the version of you that apologized too much, deferred too easily, took up too little space. None of these people necessarily wanted you to stay stuck out of malice, but the system they'd built with the old version of you was real and functioning in its way, and your transformation asks that system to reorganize itself around someone it hasn't yet learned how to hold. This is a large part of why growth is so frequently and so accurately described as lonely. It isn't only that you've lost a version of yourself, it's that some of the people who loved that version in their own limited, sometimes genuinely caring way, haven't yet figured out how to love the one who replaced it. And some of them, quietly, without ever framing it this way to themselves, resist the update. Why the resistance to grief makes the grief worse. Here's the specific mechanism that traps a lot of people in the middle of this process. Unable to either fully complete the transformation or fully return to who they were, because nobody told them the grief was coming, and because the entire cultural framing around self-improvement treats only the gains as legitimate to discuss. The emptiness that shows up partway through transformation, an emptiness that Bridges' framework would predict as an expected feature of the ending phase, gets misread instead as evidence that something has gone wrong. Rather than the neutral, disorienting territory Bridges describes as a normal, temporary phase between an old identity and a new one, it gets experienced as proof the whole project was a mistake, that the old self, whatever its problems, was at least familiar. And the unfamiliar hollowness of the middle must mean the new direction is false. This misreading is precisely what causes a significant number of people to abandon transformation midway. Not because the direction was wrong, but because the expected ordinary grief of the ending phase got mistaken for evidence, rather than recognized as process, resisting the grief, refusing to let the old self actually finish dying, tends to prolong exactly the discomfort it's trying to avoid, because an ending that's resisted rather than allowed doesn't resolve, it lingers, half completed, generating the specific unease of neither fully being who you were nor fully becoming who you're working toward. What actually helps? Given all this, the useful shift isn't a technique for skipping the grief, since Bridges' framework and the identity research both suggest that isn't actually available. It's permission to name the loss honestly, as a loss, rather than performing an artificially cheerful account of transformation that has no room in it for anything difficult, the version of you that's ending, whatever its flaws, however clearly it needed to go, was a real, structurally significant part of how you understood yourself for years, sometimes for your entire life up to this point. Grieving it isn't evidence of ambivalence about the change or secret attachment to dysfunction. It's the appropriate, proportionate response to losing something that large, and it deserves the same legitimacy any other loss would be given, rather than being quietly suppressed because the loss happens to have been self-initiated and, on balance, for the better. So if you're in the middle of becoming someone better and it feels unexpectedly like grief rather than triumph, that isn't a sign you've gone off course. It's a sign the ending is actually happening properly, rather than being skipped past on the way to a beginning that was never going to arrive intact if the ending wasn't allowed to complete itself first. You're not just building someone new, you're also quietly burying someone you knew for a long time. Let that take exactly as long as it needs to. The new self was never going to be trustworthy if it was built on top of an ending nobody let you finish.